Welcome to Stranger Encounters. I'm Tommy Salmons. Today's guest is Damien Foord, a professional brander. He's done work with LinkedIn and Tesla. In this episode, we discuss the psychology of branding, making business more human, defining a business, how they make money, and what their goals should be. How brands change over time. When do you brand? Of course, what would a podcast be without a little Trump? And finally, why do people relate to the Kardashians and not corporations? I hope you enjoy.
The first thing, Damien, I really want to talk to you about is I was listening to your first interview on Successful Dropout yesterday, and you brought up that anybody who is good at branding loves psychology. And I thought that was just like such an interesting facet, because that's something I've found this year that I'm really interested in, and I didn't know I was interested in it, is the psychology and how people look at things. Can you get into the psychology of branding a little bit?
Yeah, so I mean, for me, I started as a designer, and it was going to school. One of the reasons why I didn't go to school is because I couldn't decide. Like, I liked design, but I also knew I liked business and entrepreneurship, and I knew I really liked psychology, sociology, and cognitive science. Mm-hmm. And I just didn't, it took me 10 years before I realized, like, the intersection of all those things really is brand. And so I started just kind of on my own. I'm very lucky that, one of my dad's big pieces of advice for me growing up was always, whatever you do something that you love, right? And whatever, if you just focus on what you love to do, then the rest of it will all kind of work out. And it's certainly been true for me. So I just did a ton of research on my own, about, the intersection of kind of psychology and business and brand and how that stuff works, and certainly color theory and all these different subjects that were really about how do people conceptualize different things, right? And then from there, how do people build a mental model for the world around them? And so I'm a really big fan of Carl Jung and kind of his perspective on the way that we shape our reality through our thoughts, and our thoughts in turn are reinforced by our words. And so, there's kind of two main things that I see as really central in brand. It's one, it's that our reality, our brain at any moment, right? There's just so many data points in our field of view of what we're looking at. So we're only taking in, a very small percentage of that. And those are the things that, depending on, the quality of your eyesight or the quality of the light at that time, it's also dependent on how much you're capable of picking up, right? And so because you're picking up so much, your brain is only going to, cue you in to a small percentage of what you're looking at. And what we choose to pick up and look at and focus on is highly dependent on what we have kind of pre-programmed our brain to know is important or significant to us. So two different people, if you show them something, especially if there's any limit on the period of time that they're looking at it, they are capable of seeing wildly different things. And then we build a model to try to fill in the gaps. And so then I really, my whole career looked at how that relates to design, and how I can make a logo or I can make a website, and two people will see very different things when I make that. And so how do you design in such a way that you're either planning for those different views that people are going to take of the composition, or even one better, how do you engineer with that in mind? How do you design in such a way that you're aware that people are going to look at it differently, and how might creating different moments within a design trigger people to look at it one way or another? So that's kind of the one way, right? There's, like I said, there's two main things I look at from a psychological perspective. The first is the mental model that we build of the world and how that influences what we see. Right. The second is our sense of identity. So the other thing that super influences what we perceive is our place in relation to the world around us and how we define who we are and what meaning we create around that. The reality is, I'm no different than, the like raccoon prowling through my trash cans last night, right? I'm just an animal walking across the environment. But we create all these different things, clothes, houses, that have very little utilitarian purpose, but in reality, psychologically serve to separate us from the natural world and from this idea that we're an animal, right? So we build these really complex ideas of identity, and most of it is just like desperately, hopefully trying to create an image of ourselves that we feel, less shame and more pride around. And so when you can understand what are the things that people are hiding from, then you can understand what is the identity that they're building in response to that. And when people are interacting with a business, certainly with a design, what people see as beautiful or not in art is most often what they're reacting to in their identity, right? So what does this say or not say about me? And is that in line with what I want people to say or not say about me? Mm-hmm. And so when you can, touch on those things, you can use that to take advantage of people and make them buy more useless shit. Like I said in the Successful Dropouts podcast, I spent time in the military doing intelligence collection and interrogations. So you can use this type of knowledge to understand how to get information from people that they don't want you to have, and use that information against them. Right. At the end of the day, I got really tired of using this just against people. It just, beyond the fact that morally it didn't feel good, more importantly, it just seemed like a missed opportunity. And so, when I think about the movie Monsters, Inc., right? I don't know if you've seen it, but throughout the whole movie, they felt like they needed to harvest fear in order to gain energy. This is the way, like, most of our society lives. It's funny because it's like an awesome kids movie. Yeah. At the end, they realize laughter is just exponentially more powerful than fear. And so, like, that's something that I recognized that, using this understanding of people in order to know whether or not they stole from the local liquor store is like a really poor use of this knowledge. And, if we could turn it on its head and help people understand themselves better, empower them to make better business decisions, and through that be of better service to other people, then you create this like positive feedback loop. And so that's kind of what I've spent certainly the last 5 years of my career really intensely focused on.
Okay. That gets my mind like just reeling on all kinds of different directions. So, I think I want to start like with, something I've been reading recently is I've been reading, and paying attention to, listening to, speeches by Simon Sinek, and I'm reading his book. It starts with Why, and I know you referenced that whenever you were talking to Kylan. In that book, he's discussing let's take Apple for instance, or he uses Martin Luther King Jr. as well, and he's talking about how, how people want to be identified a specific way, and you brought this up, and you're talking about what brand says about them. So whenever you're talking about branding, you've made stringent points in the past to make sure to separate, or at least like point out that the logo is only one key, one component. It's not the entire thing. Which makes a lot of sense. And Simon talks about the why. So like when you're branding, how much of your branding is trying to incorporate that why and burn it into people's head? And one of the first images I think of whenever I think of branding here in the South, especially, is Coca-Cola. And the reason is, it's not because, I mean, I like Coke, and if I drink any soda, it's going to be a Coke. But what really makes it stand out for me, especially here in the South, is we call everything Coke. If you want a Dr. Pepper, yeah, will you buy me a Coke? If you want a Pepsi, will you buy me a Coke? Blah blah blah. It's not about the brand. It's become kind of like when Simon's talking about TiVo. It's become like the thing, like the entire category. So how much of your branding, in order to create that kind of brand, how much of that is really understanding how to incorporate the why into the brand?
Yeah, so I mean, there's a number of different things. That's another one of my core sciences that I pull into the way I look at brand is linguistics and semiotics, and the way we think about kind of symbolic representations of concepts through language, right? And what we're talking about when I say Kleenex instead of a tissue, right, and use a brand name, is it's really you're causing a new symbolic representation to be formed in language, right? So the same way your parents did it to you as a child constantly, everything that you see around you, one way or another, someone created that symbolic representation to you, right? You only know that something is a shoe because your mom held it up to you and said shoe, shoe enough times, right? And so understanding how do you replace one of those cognitive symbolic representations once they've already been made. And there's all kinds of different studies that have been done on this. And of course, as you can imagine, a lot of people trying to crack that code. Really what it comes down to, though, is creating a high enough level of positive affinity and coupling that with what's seen as utilitarian use, right? Even though, like you might say, drinking a Coke, there's nothing necessary like super utilitarian about that, but there is in your mind, right? You're performing a function, and you associate that function positively with this name.
Right.
The other thing that is key to being able to do that is within your social group, right? You even mentioned that that's kind of a Southern thing to call everything Coke, right? So, the key is how do you get a particular social group to adopt this thing? And now we're talking about collective identity, which collective identity is something that I could similarly talk about forever. But, versus personal identity is one thing. And really when we're talking about a business, we're always talking about collective identity. And now they talk about that a lot in terms of company culture. It's becoming a very popular thing to talk about. In reality, brand and company culture are really one and the same, right? Brand is who you are, right? And who I am with my friends is one determinant of that. Who I am with my family is another determinant, right? So our marketing communications, right, which brand is really like as an industry is way too focused on the customer right now. Our marketing communications out to our consumer base is just one expression of brand. Internal communications and company culture is another expression of the same brand. That brand is the core identity of the business, right? So, and we're talking again in a identity in a collective sense. So when we talk about collective identity, you can think about what it means to be an American, right? You share a sense of collective identity with other Americans. There's certain visuals that come to mind. Maybe there's certain words, okay? And there's things that you do, right? Every 4th of July, I'm somewhere underneath an explosion, right? That's like, this is an odd ritual that I have that ties me back to this idea that I'm an American. And it's something that most Americans share. Right. So, culture or collective identity lives in language, ritual, and symbol. Okay, so whenever you define a particular language, ritual, and symbol around what it is that you're trying to brand or create a sense of identity or culture around, that's how that's continually reinforced. And Coca-Cola has done a particularly good job of expressing that language, ritual, and symbol. So figuring out the why is just the beginning. Like, that's just the beginning. How do you translate that why into language and ritual and symbol that makes sense? And then how do you get those language, rituals, and symbols out in front of people? Right. And so that's the whole game, right? Is it like you have to figure it out, and then you have to express it, and then you have to activate it. And so in doing that, Coca-Cola has been able to do all these things that we don't even recognize are happening, right? They think about what are different cultural experiences that we have a high level of affinity for. And then they make sure that they put their brand name and symbols, right? Either their logo or even just their color, the shape of the bottle is trademarked, right? It's because they're protecting these symbols that we positively associate with Coca-Cola. And so when you kind of put all those together, I'm out at 4th of July and there's always a Coca-Cola sign there and I'm always drinking a Coca-Cola. I'm out at the gas station on a summer day and I'm grabbing some lemonade from the stand and there's a Coca-Cola right there, right? I'm not even consuming their product, but I'm associating this experience with them, right? And so then you start to just have this positive affinity, and kind of the same way that like your cousin might not be the best mechanic, but you go to him because he's your cousin. Like Coca-Cola starts to become part of the family. So it doesn't even matter if it's actually, observably better than Pepsi, right? It just matters that it has a seat at my table.
Right. Yeah. And picking any kind of brand to be loyal to is that's a subjective thing within itself.
It really has a lot to do with whether or not they've been able to place themselves within your social circle. Has a lot to do with it. And how you get placed in the social circle increasingly every day is the alignment that people feel with your reason for being, right? So, Simon Sinek talks a lot about your why. There's a number of reasons why that's a really great framework to start. And then there's a philosophical precept that he's touching on there, and it's this idea of raison d'etre, your reason for being, right? And it's like a philosophical problem people have talked about, for hundreds of years, really thousands, but it's within those terms, hundreds of years. And the idea is like, why do I exist? Right? And it's like me asking that of myself personally, like, what is my place within this universe? This is like the ultimate philosophical question that everybody asks at some point in their life, and all people have asked, for as long as we can tell. And we still don't have really great answers, other than kind of the journey of life is deciding what is that going to be for you. Now, knowing that is the ultimate, most human thing that we all do since the beginning of time, right? Knowing that, what makes a business more human, right? A business having their own answer for that question. Why does this business exist? Why does it have a place within this environment? What purpose does it serve, right?
It's grand narrative.
And so it's really like, exactly. So by a business having its why clearly defined, all it's doing is echoing to the people around it their own questioning of their own why. And if you can find any level of alignment there, then you become friends. And we do this all the time, right? This is how you make friends with a dude. But, so all a business is trying to do is they're trying to understand what social interaction, what mechanisms psychologically are at play that then cause you to become friends with somebody, right? And so, that's kind of what's at the core of all of it.
So one of the ways I found that I was interested in psychology was listening to Jordan Peterson. And I don't know if you pay any attention to him. And I was kind of like, about the whole scandal he was going through. But when I ran across his lectures what was the name of the lectures? Oh my goodness, I'm drawing a blank. It was his 12-part lecture series he did in class, and he was talking, and he ties everything into the archetype, and how there's within the psychology of people, there are these recognizable archetypal figures, and describing the mother as chaos, and the father as turning chaos into order, and this, that, and the other. How in depth do you think these companies get into modeling their brands after an archetype in order to subconsciously draw people into brand loyalty?
Yeah, so I mean, archetypes, at the root of each archetype is these like universal human drivers, right? So there's very few actual drivers behind our behaviors. It all kind of boils down to a handful of certain things, and then from those drivers, based on what is driving you, kind of defines the archetype. And so you have to you don't want to look directly at, okay, this is the driver, what archetype is it? What you want to look at is really like what driver does this product or service align with, right? You don't necessarily want to be the archetype. You want to be a tool for the archetype.
Oh, okay.
And now I think humanity in general, for a number of reasons, is getting psychologically much more complex. And as we do that, there's kind of this synthesis that myself and a few other people are doing. There's kind of like a next wave of archetypes. So first of all, big companies, they're all living and breathing archetypes.
Right.
It's a huge part of certainly your external communications, but internal as well. We spend a lot of time working with companies focused very heavily on what are the different what main archetype do you represent, what archetypes are represented in your customer base, and what synthesis can be created in the middle. And that's actually where I think there's something really powerful, right? Is that, if I look at you as a person and me as a person and how the average person might describe the both of us, there might be reasons why people would say, oh, these guys are really different, right? But then there are points of similarity that allow us to have a level of relationship and have good conversation and enjoy that, right? And so, that's kind of what's been missing from archetypes as they've been done in the past, is being able to recognize that in humans, okay, you're being driven by a universal human driver and and so I could put you into a box of an archetype pretty quickly. And myself. But what's important isn't what's your archetype and what's my archetype. What's important is what is created in the middle. There's a third archetype created when we interact with each other. The relationship itself has its own consciousness, has its own personality. And so the brand, that's what collective identity is, right? We recognize the United States has its own personality, has its own, different language, ritual, and symbol associated with it. All that is a collective of many people, right? And so understand that happens not just at 330 million people, that also happens between two people.
Right.
And so there's always a collective identity. And so it's, people look too much at the company's archetype or the customer's archetype, and they're not looking enough at what is the archetype that exists in the collective identity between the two. Does that make sense?
Yeah. And how okay, like this might be way out there, but this is really interesting to me. So how do you determine the collective archetype? Like let's say an archetype between like you and I. Like how would you determine that? Would it be the feeling of the interaction? Would it be or would it be the word? It wouldn't be the word spoken. It would have to be underlying in some way. I'm just trying to figure out how you would identify that.
Yeah, I know. I applaud you because just what you said is already much further ahead than a lot of people whom I have this conversation with. You're exactly right. The biggest problem. Okay, so I tell people all the time that Start With Why actually ruined like the brand as an industry, and not because the book is bad. The book is great, but it's because it caused tons of people to go out and ask people, "What's your why?" You know, and that's not how you're going to get the answer, right? I'm not going to understand your why by holding a workshop and understanding what's important to you. That's crazy. Okay. If I want to understand what your why is, first of all, I need to understand two things. One, you don't know. Period. You do not know what your why is. Second, you are going to be your subconscious is extremely defensive of me finding that out. And so I'm going to have to wade through a lot of lies and a lot of bullshit, and not because you're a liar or a shitty person. It's because that's what we do as humans. And so this is where my background in intelligence and in interrogations comes in, right? In that, if I'm hopefully right now having a conversation with your conscious self. And so in order to find out that information, what your why is, or what is this kind of shared collective identity, I need to be having a conversation with your subconscious self. And how does the subconscious have a conversation with me? How do you do that? Well, it turns out that was, that code was cracked with the Unabomber, Ted Kaczynski. The way they caught him is by analyzing his linguistics, because while the words on the page of the manifesto that he sent out was the communications of his conscious self, the words that he chose to use when, what synonyms you use more commonly than others. There's some that's like cultural vernacular, things like this. These are subconscious. This is where the subconscious speaks. The places where we're not consciously thinking through, like, this is what I want to use, but we don't even recognize we just said that. And so one way, and this isn't the only way, but one way that you get to these is you have to ask a lot of questions and have a lot of conversations and capture all the things that are said. And then you need to do a linguistic analysis based on, like, if I talk to you all day and you talk about family a lot, you might really be you might just be talking about family because you want me to think that family is important to you, or certainly you might even think it's important to you, but really that's just because your identity needs you to believe that it's important to you. Doesn't necessarily mean that it is at all. But I can tell by the context that you use family in, or what kind of words you're using around family. Once I'm able to identify the anchor point of what it is that you want me to believe, I can look at the context and the words that you use around it to see what else is actually being said. And so, when I'm branding a company, we go through a long process of kind of excavating all this. It's the same way interrogation works, right? When you're being interrogated, people imagine that a cop is going to say, "Where were you on Thursday night?" Okay, I've had conversations with people where they were like, "Oh, a cop could never get me to tell them what they want to know." And I always say, like, man, the people who fold the fastest are the ones who think that they're going to do a great job every time. And the thing is that all that happens is it through the course of conversation, I'm getting you to tell me all the things. I'm getting that context around what it is that you want me to believe. And by understanding the context around what you want me to believe, I'm able to understand a whole lot more about what's true. And so we do this with companies. Like I've said before, I've been thankful and very lucky to do this specific process with projects for LinkedIn and Adobe and Tesla and Epson and Marriott, a whole lot of big names, and hundreds of young companies that you probably never heard of. And it's always a really fascinating thing because we get to like dig in to this like subconscious psychology with our clients and then actually make that actionable, right? It's one thing if we blow their minds and they're like, man, how did you know that? When we tell them what we landed on, what our findings were from the experience, they're always like, wow, that is exactly right. That's really powerful. And that's great. But then what do you do with it? Right. And being able to walk people through a process of, okay, now this is how you integrate this into everything that you're trying to do. And this is how you make those insights meaningful. Being able to do that becomes super powerful. And that's where people find a whole lot of alignment with a brand, and it becomes very, very clear. And they're able to take action and buy a product or a service or whatever much more quickly because they know exactly who you are and they can sense that that's true.
Yeah, okay, that makes sense. I can see that. And in Simon Sinek's defense, I think he was quite aware that by saying start with why doesn't mean you're going to be able to identify it, and that's why he came out with the next book was Find Your Why. I think he was quite familiar with that struggle.
Totally.
So now, when you're all right, I'm trying to think of where I want to go because there's so much. This is so interesting to me. I could get so deep in the weeds where nobody wants to hear a word we're talking about though.
Totally.
When you're starting off with somebody and you're starting to help a company, how do you approach their business? Do you have a cookie cutter approach, or does it depend on the industry? Does it depend on the personality of the person? How do you go about, and what do you tell the person to look for in creating a brand?
Yeah, so there's a couple of things. The answer to your question is really kind of all of the above. We start very, very general and cookie cutter, and then we go progressively more refined and detailed as we go. Mm-hmm. And so the first step is a process that we run everyone through, which is what I was just describing, where we just have a workshop where we ask them lots of different questions from lots of different perspectives. And the idea is just to create kind of some level of pattern recognition around the way that they speak about the business. From there, then we're able to look at, their business model, right? How do you create value? How do you monetize that value? And how do you get people to want that value, right? And we look at, the business model from that perspective. And then we go deeper into, based on your specific business model and your profit model and your industry, how does this work out? And what are the kind of key areas that we want to focus on? The other thing that we integrate into that kind of around the same time is, what are your ultimate goals, right? So like the first thing that I think a lot of people discount is like, businesses are always ultimately led by how they make money. Okay. And so the idea that you think you can be one business and make money separately, and that's not going to be the heart of your business, is just crazy, right? So Facebook, for instance, is fundamentally an advertising company, period. The idea that it's a social network, that it's connecting humanity, is total bullshit. It's driven totally by where they get their profit from. And so LinkedIn, by comparison, only creates products that help facilitate connections in the network. Because they want the connections in the network to stay at its core. And so, whatever you're doing in your business, understanding how you make money and is really important, not just practically because we need to make money. It's important to understand that that's going to influence your decisions more than anything else. The second thing right behind that's going to influence your decisions is going to be, what's your ultimate goal? What are you trying to do with this, right? And I speak to a lot of companies that want to exist just for 5 years, get enough traction and be acquired. Right? There are people who are trying to change the world, and then there are people who just want to have something that supplements a 9 to 5. And so by understanding what are your goals for this, that drastically changes what types of decisions we would make. So by looking at those two things, from there we can start to recognize areas of opportunity. Like, okay, there's your conversion rate is a little low here in order to get to where you're trying to go. And so how do we optimize for that conversion rate? Those types of things are going to be unique to each company. But that's kind of like the third phase that we get into.
So there's something that strikes me that it seems like a lot of small business owners or entrepreneurs struggle with. And that is exactly what is their target customer, their who, seems to be generally a problem. And then what it is exactly that they're going to do long term. And my wife and I have struggled with this with her starting a virtual assistant business, and she's just actually yesterday and today she got her first 2 clients, so which was really exciting. And she actually, so this is going to be on the podcast, but whatever, she actually told me to thank you for accepting her request on LinkedIn. She is Beatrix Berger. She got a hold of you yesterday. And she was like, oh yeah, tell him I said thank you. And I was like, okay, yeah, I will. And so how when you're creating the brand, and you're not like real certain long term, like, like, okay, I want to work for myself. I don't want to work for somebody else. And I'm not certain long term I'm going to be doing exactly what I'm doing today. Do you take into consideration, like, when you're building the brand, you want it to kind of cover like a general area and be kind of like fluid and able to move along with the company? Or is it something that you can rebrand and successfully rebrand as your company evolves?
Yeah, so a brand is always going to be changing. There are things that are deep down that are going to be true and likely, will change certainly a whole lot less often and less likely.
Okay.
And it's important, like, just like if you think about you as a person, if you think about you back in high school, I'm sure there are things that have drastically changed just about what you thought were important. And the things that you wanted and the things that made you excited to get up in the morning. I think those have probably changed a lot since high school. The thing that's important to understand about that is with those changes, also, I'm sure your circle of friends has largely changed too. And so you're going to have to rebrand. I recommend to my customers once a year. And in between rebrands, don't think about the change at all, unless there's been some major event and you really need to. Right. I would say, like, just know that it's going to be handled on that date, next year. And until then, you have to be 100% committed to the brand that you currently have.
Right.
But refreshing it once a year is really important. I would stay away from major changes, more than every 3 years. And, we could talk a lot about what kind of defines major changes, but I think the important thing here is, especially with small businesses, and kind of, what do they call it? Solopreneurs, right? People who are their own business. Yeah. I think the important thing is a lot of people think about what are you good at, and they make that their what you do. And your what are you good at should not be what you do. What you're good at should be how you do it. And what you really love spending your time in should be what you do. So I'll explain that a little bit. I was working with a client, and his background was really deep in logistics. I did a write-up on this called what business should I start? It's somewhere. It's either on my LinkedIn or something like that. But the idea is he had a really deep background in logistics, right? So he knew that that's what he did. And so he wanted to go out on his own. So he said, all I can do is logistics. So like, I guess I could start like a logistics consulting company. And I was like, whoa, no, like, don't do that. And I started asking, like, what do you like? And he just couldn't break his mind outside of like within logistics. These are the things that he likes. And I was like, okay. So we like broke for the day, and I started looking at his social media. He's super active on Twitter. And so I was like digging all through his Twitter, and he would get in these really intense debates with people about like the business of the NFL, right? Not like talking about players and stuff, but actually like the way the NFL like creates policy and the way it's run and kind of stuff that I've never given two shits about football, right? So I just recognized like there's actually like a passion for sports business here. And so now if what you do is that passion, sports business, right? And then we're looking at how you do it being like your knowledge of logistics. Now you can kind of backtrack and say, how can I apply this knowledge of logistics into sports business and help kind of define something a little better? You know, and he couldn't like leave the office and go be working with people in the NFL on logistics the next day, right? But what it did is it helped us create a long-term plan into how he can develop an expertise around something that he can sell. The most important thing about that is that the reason why I'm such a nut with brand, and I'm really confident in being able to debate anybody in the world in brand. And I've talked to people, I've had conversations, I've spoken on panels with some of the biggest agencies in the world, and talked to their head brand people. And I've never had a problem having a conversation with any of them. And the reason why is because a lot of them are in that job because it pays their bills. I'm in this job because I obsess over this constantly, right? My only friends are people who, have these conversations with me about it because this is what I love. I love doing it. So I'm just going to do that. I'm going to do 5 hours more of research and reading every day than the average person.
Right.
And when that adds up over 10 years, there's just an insurmountable advantage to that. And so I saw that same type of passion in this client and his love of the business of football. Now, are there people who understand the business of football better than him? Sure. Yeah, absolutely. Are there people who understand the business of football better than him and have as strong a logistics background as he does? Now you're talking about a much smaller pool, right? Right. And so, and of those people, there's a good handful of them that either did logistics because that's where they ended up, or did football because it pays the bills. And so you're creating a place where you have a much higher advantage. And anytime you want to like redefine yourself and, start something totally new, it's going to take a lot of work. Like I just, it's one thing. I don't agree with everything Gary Vee says, but I'm really glad that he says this because it's just like, the idea that there are people out here selling, look at my Ferrari, you can be a millionaire next year. Like, it's just total bullshit. Like the idea that you can create tons of passive income with very little work is just like, me selling you that there's great odds of winning the lottery, right? Like it's just a really bad bet to make. The reality is you really have to ask yourself, like, what would make me happy doing a ton of really hard work? And, when you can kind of find that answer, like I work a ridiculous amount of hours. Anytime I talk to people about it, they, have a hard time even believing it. I'm working all the time. And the reason is because I love what I do.
Right.
And so it's that simple. And so being able to, it can't be underestimated the advantage that you create by first double down on what it is that you love and then find a way to monetize that with skills that you already have.
find work that doesn't feel like work.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, I know.
No, and then people, a huge part of one of the reasons why my clients work with me is because I'm so fucking excited every single time we go into a consultation. Most consultants come in and are like, oh, okay, let me run you through the spiel. I run everybody through, right? And it's like, that's not me. I'm fucking jazzed to hear your story and pick it all apart and prod all your sensitive areas and challenge you. And, I love doing it every single time. And I've been doing it for years, and like, it has not, it still doesn't get old to me. And so, when you have that kind of energy you can bring to your work, people want to work with you. It's really tough to have that energy about something that you really don't give two shits about, but it makes you money.
Yeah. Well, you were talking about having debates and other styles of branding and consultation and this, that, and the other. What are some like major misconceptions out there that people like traps that people fall into and they really believe? I know thinking that one of the most common ones, I guess, would be that thinking that your logo is the end all be all of your brand. But what other misconceptions do you run into that you have to overcome and that you debate people on?
I had a conversation with a potential client the other day, and they said, they're a group within a large company, and a large company has given them permission to kind of break off into a subsidiary. So now they're looking at branding this new company, right? And so I told them, I'm super excited to be involved. I have a really good idea of getting them where they need to go and how that can be helpful for them. And I, let them know the price, and they were like, oh man, like, I'm sure that it's worth every penny, but we're just so early in the process. We don't have that kind of budget set aside yet. But we're going to meet on Tuesday to talk about what our name should be, what our values should be. And I was like, what? How do you think it's important enough that you have permission from the company to do it? You are going to have a conversation. You've already selected the team that's moving off into the subsidiary. You've already, you're having conversations around what your values as a company should be, but you don't think it's worth setting aside some money to make sure you get that right. It's just like, yeah, like the idea to me, the biggest misconception that I deal with all the time is that brand is kind of a nice to have later down the road. Like in the beginning, you can just hustle and then get a brand, like build that and hone it, get it right later on. And I've got a slew of very young company clients who I could talk to, who I could, introduce anybody to, and would tell you like they felt the same way before they did the engagement with me. And then afterwards they were like, yeah, no, you should this should be the first thing you spend your money on, because the very next thing you're going to do after you build a true brand is you're going to go back and change a bunch of shit that you've done. And then you're going to go and kick yourself because you're going to realize how much money you've left on the table because you just weren't very clear about who you were or why you're even doing the business. I mean, it's just like, it's funny, right? Because starting your own business is just like a really serious thing, right? Like it takes a ton of our time and energy. It's, hopefully how we make our bills. And sometimes it's why we're not making our bills, right?
Yeah.
And yet, like, how much time do we spend even asking the question, like, why the fuck do I want to do this? Like, I mean, it's just shocking to me, and I don't blame them, all right? I've been the same guy, and I totally get it. But it's like I work with so many entrepreneurs that then when I ask them, why do you do this? And they're like, oh, because I want to change the way the food industry is marketed, and it's like, okay, like, that's a bullshit answer that you've learned to give people when they ask you this. Like, but like, why did you leave a comfortable job to do this insane thing? And it's like, after 2 hours of discussion, it finally comes down to like, oh, like my grandmother, she used to do this thing. And there's always like some deep story there. And it's like, we just don't spend a time to really know that. And so the truth is, like, yeah, is it any wonder that we have a problem finding product market fit? We don't know ourselves or know our business well enough to know why anyone else should like it. And so 97% of businesses fail within their first 5 years, right? 97%.
Yeah.
The vast majority of both of those, the top number one and number two by a mile, are sales and marketing. Okay, which I would say after, 10 years of consulting with businesses and almost 20 in doing, design related, I was always working. My core clients were always in startups. Actually, TiVo, when it was really early, my brother was an early employee at TiVo. So having connections there, right? But all the 10 years of working in consulting, 20 years of working in design, right? What I've learned is 90% of the time when a company says they have a sales problem, it's a marketing problem, right? Like they say, no, we have a sales problem. It's a huge sales problem. We've got all these sales issues. And I'm like, okay, like I take a look at like their sales process and like they have shit leads. And it's like, no, you don't have a sales problem. You have a lead generation problem. You're giving your salespeople shitty leads, and so no wonder they're having a hard time converting. What you're having a hard time doing is finding the right customers, right? Which is in essence a marketing problem, and you're having a hard time finding the right customers because you don't know who you are. Yeah. And why is this truly valuable to you? And then you'll be able to connect to that same thing in your customers once you understand that. So in this process, the people that we've done it for, it's fairly regular to show 10x results on things because it just impacts so many different areas of your business, things that are all running in every direction really screwy, and it just like aligns them and puts them in perfect motion where each piece is interacting on the next piece. And it focuses that. So, difference between a light bulb and a laser beam, right? It's both just photons. The difference is focus, right? Like a light bulb just scatters the photons everywhere. A laser beam is cutting through shit because of focus. So that's kind of like, the best metaphor I have for, that's the biggest misconception is just people think that it's something you do later when you're big. And it's just like, yes, if you're a fan of losing money, that's fine.
I'm actually surprised that people think that way because there are so many celebrities out there that are nothing but a brand. They've never been anything else but a brand. I mean, you look at the Kardashians or, Paris Hilton or whatever. That's all they are. They're just a brand. They're nothing else.
Billions of dollars. Yeah.
Right. Yeah.
The Kardashian family, I came across it just the other day, just like as a collective, how much they're worth, and I forget, but it's like it's obscene. Billions and billions of dollars, and it's really just brand, right? But there's something what they're doing is like they are really tapped into the zeitgeist of this generation. Right? Like the collective identity, I mean, they embody it. And I would argue that, by and large, like, however anybody feels about Trump, he wasn't elected on policy, right? He was elected on brand.
Yep.
He was really connected.
I was actually remiss to bring that up because I was thinking about it. Like I've been thinking about it when I was reading It Starts With Why. I was thinking about it whenever I was listening to you talk to Kylan, and I was like, well, it's about what people I heard. It's not about what he said. It's about what people heard.
Yes.
When he said "Make America Great Again," what did people think of? And I've tried to steel man that argument so many times. I try because whenever I run up against somebody that I disagree with, I try to steel man their argument to the best of my ability to try to figure out what exactly are you hearing, what exactly are you seeing, like what is it, like, and I get it, but when like a lot of these people they're thinking like you got to think there are a certain percentage of people that listen to Make America Great Again, and they think post World War II America. They think one income families. You know, they're thinking comfort. They're thinking, you know, the traditional family structure, you know, and I don't know. I'm not mad at them for thinking that way. You know, there's a certain amount of people that want that economic comfort of having one person to go to work, and even in a low income family, they can live off of one income, and we don't have that today. We're so far removed from that, it's ridiculous.
Yep. I think there's a definition of intelligence that says intelligence is being able to hold two conflicting ideas and recognize them both to be true. You know, and that's the thing, right? Is I'm completely able to see, you know, what's really behind Make America Great Again isn't, while it's pulling up memories of post World War II America. It's what it's really speaking to is the lack that we are seeing right now, right? So it's really not about the past at all. It's using the past as a proxy to really make you think by comparison about how bad things are away from where we want them to be today.
Wow.
Right? And so in doing that, that's something that I think both left and right can agree on. And then people get, you know, started arguing over, like, well, Make America Great Again. Was America ever great? Was it only great for white people or some people? Or, you know, and you know, I sympathize with both sides of all the arguments in there. I have a lot of conservative friends because I was in the military and I was in law enforcement. And I have a lot of liberal friends because I live in Silicon Valley in California. And so I've had the conversation on both sides. It's really funny, right? My liberal friends think I'm conservative. My conservative friends think I'm liberal. And it's really just because I challenge people on their ideas that they hold, right?
That's the definition of being a libertarian.
Right, yeah. Well, this is a conversation for another day, a whole new
right?
But you know, something really interesting is that Steve Bannon was on Bill Maher recently,
right?
And he said that Democrats need to ignore the idea of like Kamala Harris or Elizabeth Warren because an establishment politician is not going to win. Right. If the Democrats were smart, they'd be prepping somebody like Oprah, and you know, people. And so I posted something about this, and people flipped out. All my Democrat friends, all my liberal friends were like, well, you know, Oprah's not really a Democrat. And it's like, no, that's not the point. Trump's not a Republican, right?
Yeah,
like,
he's not a conservative.
Steve Bannon is actually, this is very sage advice that Steve Bannon's giving, and he's exactly right. What he's saying is don't put someone up on policy, put someone up on brand.
Right.
Because that's what got Trump elected. And if liberals want to win in 2020, you're going to have to elect somebody on brand.
Yeah.
And you know, I would say by and large, Bernie Sanders was able to fill that mold in a lot of ways for liberals. I could talk about it. It's a longer story. But, you know, either way, I think it's really interesting. And it's like I said, you know, there's a number of things happening kind of from like a social evolution perspective, that the psychology of humanity as a whole is getting more complex, more data points to analyze, more levels of interaction, right? And so because we have more levels of interaction and exposure, that's creating a level of depth to it. And so as we do that, we're looking for things that are more psychologically complex. So authenticity means more, right? And politicians have a tendency to run as these monolithic, faceless ideas, right? Oh, I represent this idea. A brand is something that's more nuanced and complex. And so I would actually say that, you know, while people think Trump was elected, you know, on the simplicity of his message, I actually think he was elected on the complexity of it.
Yeah.
Whether you agree with him or you side with him or not, the reality is that there's a depth and a nuance to that goes beyond just policy, right? Trump is speaking to people as people, instead of, people as platforms.
Right.
So,
and I think that was that, and we'll get off of this here in a second, but
yeah.
just to add on to that, I think that's what part of what people heard is Trump was being honest in ways that other politicians would not, and they would cover up through platitudes. And people saw through that.
Absolutely.
And they were like,
Totally.
yeah. I actually posted the other day. I don't know if you saw it, but it was an interesting experiment done by a college up in New York, when what they did, like after the second debate between Trump and Hillary Clinton, they switched the gender roles, and they had an actress learn all of Trump's mannerisms, all of his lines, and they had an actor learn all of Hillary Clinton's mannerisms and all of her lines. And when you watch it and then you read the article that followed it about how people perceived it, it really kind of opened your eyes. It was really, I found it really interesting.
And that's got to be super interesting. I'd love to check that out.
Yeah, I'll tag you in it. I posted it the other day. I'll tag you in it when we get off here. But you were talking about the Kardashians a while ago and how much they're worth, okay? And you know, the first thing that popped into my head is nobody complains when you hear all this about attacking the 1%, and nobody complains about how much money actors and actresses have, but they complain about, people like Jeff Bezos and Amazon.
Totally.
And I think that goes to a level of branding that Hollywood has completely mastered, a certain level of branding into making these people that are so out of touch with the entire country seem relatable. And people can't relate to somebody like Jeff Bezos, who owned Amazon, didn't take any profit for 10 years, turned around and bought the Washington Post, and now he's buying Whole Foods. There's no way of relating to that. They just see that and they're like, oh, that's out of control. How is it that people find actors and actresses so relatable, but they can't relate to the business owner? They can't even project themselves to say, I would like to have a tenth of that success, and I respect him for what he did.
Yeah, well, what happened there, right, is you had this convergence that happened in the center. Hollywood used to be all brand and no business. And then you had the general business world, all business and no brand, right? Brand being the interface to our humanity, right? Again, what gives Coca-Cola the opportunity to have a seat at our table as if it's a friend, right? So Bezos, and now in the last 20 years, businesses have done a good job of applying a brand to their business, right? But it doesn't extend beyond the profitability of it. Whereas Kim Kardashian sees herself as the brand, and the business comes second. So what that means is that there's a priority given towards relating to the people. And then they realize, like, oh, you can make money off of that relation. And honestly, business is starting to meet that in the middle a little bit. But there's still a long ways to go. And a lot of it has just to do with a lack of imagination about how, business and can really be branded, and how psychology can drive this. When I talk to people about giving a business a seat at the table, and you have to imagine, I always do this, right? In my mind, when I'm working with a company, I imagine that a company isn't a company. I imagine that it's like a robot, right? And a very humanoid looking robot. And it wants to come be a part of our social circle, but it's super awkward and it doesn't understand the way we think and the way we work and our emotions. And we recognize the robot and we see its lack of emotional affect, and we're like, no, stay over there. I'll come to you when I want something. And if you think about it, this is really how we treat most businesses, right? But then if you can give it this special interface, to where like it can just plug into our humanity and we say, oh, you're one of us. Come sit down. Tell us what you need. Tell us how you can help us. Right. And so that's what brand is the magic of. Right. It's like, the human looking skin that you can put over the robot that allows people to say like, oh, I think you're one of us. Like, come on in.
Okay. Hold on. One second. Let me.
Yeah.
I'm just trying to work this out in my head. Okay. So Bezos, in the eye of the public. Okay. So Bezos is not the owner of the man that owns Amazon. Bezos is Amazon. Yes,
exactly.
Zuckerberg is not the owner of Facebook. He is Facebook.
Right. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. No, I get it. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense.
And I think there's levels of complexity deeper than that, but we can like kind of leave that there. It's funny that you brought up Bezos actually, because one of the things that I wanted to make sure I said earlier when you said what are the biggest misconceptions that you run across.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
One of them is because of Bezos. So anytime I'm somewhere and someone says like, what is brand? It's a question I ask people all the time. Like, what do you think brand is? Right. And everybody always says like, brand is what your customers say about you when you leave the room. And they quote Jeff Bezos. And I say that's utter bullshit. And people are like, oh, you think you know better than Bezos? And I say, yes, I do. I spend all my time focused on this. Bezos does not. He said this off-the-cuff remark without even really thinking about it. And everybody enshrines it in gold. You know what I mean? Like, he's not a brand person. Do I think I know how to scale a giant retailer and an online retailer better than Bezos? No. Do I think I understand brand better than he does? Yes. Do I think, like, he thought deeply and philosophically before saying that? No, I don't. So
and he probably hires people like you to take care of these things for him.
No, they absolutely do. And so I've worked with most of the big Silicon Valley tech companies. I'm in Seattle every so often. So Bezos, like I'm more than happy. You're the only one of the big tech giants that I haven't worked with yet. So, but it's what it really comes down to is this misconception that brand has something to do with your reputation, right? So the first misconception is that it's about your visual identity, right? The way you're represented, your name, your logo, your color scheme, right? That's like stage one. People think that. The people who think they're more enlightened than those people, they think that it's about your reputation. It's the way you make your customers feel. It's, and it's not that at all. It's not your reputation any more than like, if you think about who is Damien and you say, well, Damien is what I think about him. And it's like, no, that's ridiculous, right? Like, we know that what you think of me is just one aspect of who I am. And you can get a more clear picture if you ask 100 people who I am, but it's still like you're still getting a rudimentary picture of who I am as opposed to that being who I am, right? And so, that's a really important distinction to make. Like most branding companies out there are giving you a rudimentary picture of what your brand is, right? They're not telling you like, here's the dirty, deep secret of who you are in a vacuum with no one else there behind closed doors, right? Like when you ask who is Damien on a deserted island with no one else around on the third day when he starts going nuts, like then you start getting a more clear picture of who I really am, right? And so that's what we want to understand. Like, who's your company on a deserted island? Who's your company with no customers? I love that. Like, what a great question is that? If anybody talks to me and they're like, "Oh, your brand is is what your customers say about you when you leave the room," I say, "No. Like, who would this company be if customers didn't exist? If I said for the next 5 years you're not allowed to sell, what would this group of people be?" It's like, whoa, what? Just let that marinate for a while,
Well, and if you start a business, I mean, you start a business with a purpose, why are you going to let somebody else define what your business is?
Yeah, no, I think it's horrible. You know, the other piece of that is like Google is a really big fan of what is like very reactive design. It's very much an engineer's approach to design, where it's just like put up a blue button and a green button, measure which one gets better results, and then just go with whichever one performed better.
Right.
And the problem with that is you're allowing your decisions to be made by outsiders, and it lacks what in design we always have called design leadership, right? The thing is that if the Mona Lisa was painted based on like, is this what the people want to see? It never would have happened.
Right.
And yet hundreds of years later, this is hanging in a museum and there's hours long lines every single day to see it because it's captured so perfectly the human imagination. We don't really understand what it is about it that speaks to us. And so you're missing the opportunity by choosing blue or green and just use whichever one tests better. You're missing the opportunity to show that Da Vinci level leadership. And that's what Steve Jobs understood and what he tried to communicate by telling people he doesn't do market research. He gives the people what he knows they need. Right. But then with that, it comes a responsibility on you to not just people misunderstand that in thinking that Steve Jobs just like went with what he liked and made other people like it. It's like, no. It puts the responsibility on you to know what people need, whether or not it's what they like or not. Right. But it can't just be driven by your ego. You have to be really well informed about the situation.
Right.
So, yeah.
Well, hey man, we're rolling up on an hour and 20 minutes here. We're at an hour and 15. I knew this was probably going to happen because like whenever you brought up the psychology, I was like, oh, I got to ask him about this. It's going to be something that this conversation's not going to help anybody. It's just going to be fun for me. So, but I hope a lot of people got something out of it. I want to give you a chance. Let people know where to find you. And all that good jazz, your business websites, your social media, all that good jazz, so people can find you if they want to get in touch with you.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm most active on LinkedIn, so people can find me linkedin.com/in/Damien Foord, 2 O's in my last name, and that's probably the best way to get a hold of me. I really enjoy talking to people and building relationships and just understanding people. So people shouldn't hesitate to reach out and connect. You can also go to prismonde.com, PRISMONDE. And that's a consulting group that I run that does kind of brand and business strategy for businesses. And even if you think we're out of your price range, feel free to reach out, create a relationship, see if you can sell me on the idea of giving you a discount. Because, I like people, I like working with companies. So happy to connect with people and give any advice that I can.
Awesome, man. I'm going to try to get you. I'm going to get you on here again. We're going to do this again. This was a lot of fun. I'm going to shut it down. Just hang on 1 second.
Yep.
All right, guys. Thank y'all all for listening. This has been Stranger Encounters with Damien Foord. I'm Tommy Salmons. Late.